Hey guys, tonight we gather around the radio again, like we used to in those in-between moments, the hours that stretch just long enough for ghosts to walk in and memories to crawl out from the jungle. That battered zenith radio, rust-streaked and missing a knob, became the only window to something stranger than war, the sound of her voice. She came to us not with bullets, not with rockets, but with syllables spun in silk. Long before we understood her meaning, we understood her tone, soft, calm, unsettling. The Vietnamese announcer known to us as Hanoi Hannah had a cadence unlike anything else in that green, burning world. Her voice would rise through the canopy like morning mist, settle over the fire pits, and fill our ears with words we didn't want to hear but couldn't stop hearing. It wasn't her language that cut the deepest, it was her knowing. She knew our names. Not just a few. Dozens. She read them like a priest reads scripture, one breath between each syllable. One moment before the next name landed like a stone in the gut. She named units, hometowns, dates of arrival. Sometimes she listed the dead, sometimes the recently captured. Always just enough to shake us loose from whatever belief still held us together. The first time I heard her, I thought it was a prank. A psychological trick made up by some higher-up looking to keep us alert. But the radio crackled again the next night. And the next. And then she mentioned Detroit. Not the tigers, the riots. She spoke of burning buildings and battered black bodies. She described America's fractured freedom with more clarity than most of us dared to admit. It was like hearing our own doubts fed back to us in a language we barely spoke. Each night, the jungle would hum. Somewhere between the cicadas and the dripping branches, we'd turn up the volume and pretend we were just listening for enemy broadcasts. But it became more than that. We were listening for her. She was the lullaby we never asked for, the voice that tucked itself into our heads even when the fighting stopped. Some nights she was the only sound we could hear clearly. She didn't shout. She never raged. That was what made her dangerous. She was gentle. I remember how the guys reacted. At first, we joked, we called her names. Gave her an edge she didn't need. Rodriguez swore she wasn't real, that she was some stitched-together voice coming from a bunker full of tape reels. But no one could explain how she knew what she knew. Bishop started listening quietly, staring out at the tree line like he was trying to see through it. Samuels would sit with his hands folded, no expression, just breathing. By the time we hit the 4th month, no one joked anymore. Some of the guys said they hated her, that her voice made their skin crawl. But late at night, when the sky cracked open and our heads filled with rotors and screams, I'd see them listening again. Because hate wasn't the right word, it was more complicated than that. She became something of a myth, even as we knew she was real. A woman whose voice traveled farther than the range of any rifle. A stranger who seemed to know us better than we knew ourselves. We never saw her face, not in person, but the stories circulated, photos from Time magazine, reports from intelligence briefings. High cheekbones, sharp eyes, her hair pulled tight behind her head like she was going to war with words. And always that voice. Years later, after the war had grown old in our bones, I would still hear it. Not always clearly, sometimes as a whisper in a grocery store parking lot, sometimes floating through static on late-night car rides. But always her, like some part of me stayed in that jungle, where the trees bent close and the night filled with the low hum of half-buried truths. We were boys, mostly, 20, 22, some even younger. We came with ideas, with orders, with slogans stitched into our sleeves, but she made us question. She made us wonder whether the real fight was happening thousands of miles away on streets we once called home, where freedom was measured not in democracy, but in who could walk safely after dark. She never threatened us outright. She didn't have to. What she offered instead was something colder, clarity. The kind that settled into your skin and didn't come out, no matter how much mud you crawled through. She told us to go home, told us this war wasn't ours. Not like we thought it was. And the terrible thing, the thing none of us wanted to admit is that part of us believed her. The jungle never offered comfort, The leeches didn't care who you were. The mines didn't check your politics, but her voice, her strange, unwanted lullaby offered a kind of eerie solace, like she was watching over us, even as she waged her own quiet war. There are few things in combat that linger longer than the sound of a calm enemy. A man with a gun, you can shoot; a mortar, you can dodge; but a voice that gets inside your thoughts and stays there. That's not a battle you can win, that's a presence. A presence you carry back with you, long after the uniforms are boxed up and the medals gather dust. Back then, we used to listen every night. Some of us claimed we were trying to catch enemy plans. But deep down, I think we were waiting for her, waiting for the cadence, the rhythm, the strange comfort of being known. There was something terrifying about how she said she'd be back the next night, same time. Like she had all the time in the world, and we had none. And maybe that's the truth we could never shake. That she wasn't there to kill us, she was there to remind us we were already changing. That somewhere in the rice paddies and gunpowder, our beliefs were unraveling, and the unraveling sounded just like her. There was something in the air, some nights more than others, that made the jungle feel like a memory waiting to be remembered. The thick heat rose from the ground like breath held too long. Branches drooped, the river barely stirred. But from somewhere just beyond hearing, her voice always found a way back in. Even when the radio was off, even when no one dared say her name, those who had been around long enough knew it wasn't just the words she spoke. It was the silence between them, the small hush before she said a name. The way she drew out the word freedom as if testing it for cracks. She didn't shout like a soldier, didn't chant slogans like a fanatic. She floated. Her tone sat just above the static, just below the screams. It was something inhuman in its softness. There was a night in early September, when the rain wouldn't let up and the whole camp had turned to mud. Tents sagged, ponchos clung to skin like regret. The smell of mildew mixed with gun oil and bitter rice. Everyone was too tired to speak, but someone still turned on the radio. Not to find news, not to hear orders, just to see if she was there. The signal came in slow, broken by thunder and the hum of insects mating in the dark. For a long time, there was only static, the kind that sounds like wind pressed against a closed window. But then, through the noise, her voice re-emerged, clear as breath. No one moved, but they listened. They always listened. She spoke of the war like it was a fever in the mind of a sleeping empire. She described the jungle not as battlefield, but as witness trees older than any flag, rivers that refused to care which side bled into them. She spoke of American soldiers like they were sons who had wandered too far from home, and who no longer recognized their own shadows. The veterans in the unit, those who had arrived before Tet, claimed they could hear changes in her tone. They said she used to speak with a kind of fierce hope, as if this war could be ended with reason. But by now, her voice had turned more elegiac, not resigned, but mournful. She sounded like someone keeping vigil at a funeral that hadn't happened yet. Some nights she didn't name the dead. She named the living. Called out soldiers who had just arrived, who hadn't yet seen their first firefight. She welcomed them like she was the host of some quiet, grim pageant. How she learned those names remained a mystery. No one wanted to chase too far. Perhaps she had spies in Saigon. Perhaps she didn't need them. Perhaps the jungle itself whispered things to her. You remember the moment when you realized she had no intention of being forgotten. It was the night she mentioned your own hometown. She pronounced it perfectly. The name of your county, your high school, the road your father paved every winter with salt and sand. The memory flooded back in a rush. Frostbitten metal, the sound of tires cutting through slush, the glow of Christmas lights in windows long gone. How did she know? For a brief second, you felt seen. Not as a soldier, not as a weapon, but as someone who had once been a boy, who used to ride bikes downhill with his mouth open to catch snowflakes. That's what made her dangerous. Not her allegiance, not her propaganda, but her precision. She didn't just speak into the war. She spoke into the part of you that no longer fit inside the uniform. And once she had found that space, It didn't close again. You started to question things you'd kept buried, not just the politics, but the purpose. The shape of the war, its smell, its duration. Some of the guys tried to block her out. They threw rocks at the radio. Swore they wouldn't listen again, but they always came back. Like moths to a dim and distant lamp. No one admitted it, but her voice became a ritual, a strange kind of communion. Back at base, the higher-ups warned against listening. They said it was psychological warfare. They were right, but they missed the point. It wasn't that she broke your spirit. It was that she reminded you had won. There were rumors that she had once studied abroad, that she had lived in Paris, or New York, that her English was too clean, too composed, to come from textbooks alone. She never confirmed or denied anything. She didn't need to. She let the myth grow in the soil of confusion, just like everything else in that war. And when she paused just for a second, just before the static took over again, you felt something like grief. Not for her, not even for the war, but for the version of yourself that could still believe everything had meaning. You started to notice things after that, the trembling hands of rookies cleaning their rifles. The way the older guys stared too long into nothing, the sound of letters being opened in silence. No one said it, but everyone carried something heavy, and that weight had her voice wrapped inside it like a ribbon around a bomb. There was a rhythm to it now. You fought, you patrolled, you cleaned, you ate, and then you listened. Not because you wanted to, but because you couldn't stop. Even when the radio broke, even when the batteries died, even when the rain drowned out everything but your own breathing, you still heard her, in the silence, in the static, in the pulse of the jungle after a firefight, when everything else had gone still. It was never just sound, it was presence. She existed somewhere between enemy and oracle, threat and comfort. She did not raise a rifle, she did not wear a helmet, but she walked with you, night after night, without ever touching the ground. Years later, in a hotel room in the middle of nowhere, you heard a recording of her voice in a documentary. You hadn't planned on watching it. But when it came on, your body froze, your chest tightened. And just like that, it was raining again. The jungle was alive. The men were gathered around the flickering radio, and you were 20 again, waiting for the voice in the static. You turned off the television, but the sound didn't go away. It never really does. You never knew her real name until much later. During the war, she was just Hanoi Hanatu words whispered over tinned coffee and smoke, to syllables that carried more weight than any title or rank. It was easy to forget she had a life beyond the voice, a body behind the frequency. But the ones who'd been captured, the prisoners who had seen the inside of Helo, they knew her differently. They didn't speak of her often. Maybe it was the pain. Maybe it was something else, some pact forged in darkness. But every now and then, in the quiet spaces between patrols and shellings, someone would mention the Hanoi Hilton. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, they mentioned her. Thur Chong, that was her name. You heard it first from a medic who'd served near Quang. He'd treated a survivor, a downed pilot, pulled from the jungle after weeks of silence. The man was bones and fever, skin like parchment, eyes like glass. He didn't say much, not at first, but when he did speak, it was about her. Not her politics, not her propaganda, just her voice. He called her Thur Chong, said it as though it tasted strange in his mouth, half prayer, half curse. You remember how that name landed in you, heavier than expected. It changed things, gave her shape. No longer just an echo across the trees. Now she had a name stitched into the back of your mind, like a seam you couldn't unpick. She was no longer just the voice. She was someone. A woman, flesh and bone. Someone who might have walked through the same streets you patrolled, though her shoes would have made no sound. There were stories, half rumor, half confession, that she had visited the camps where American POWs were kept, that she had spoken to them directly. Not to interrogate, not to humiliate, just to talk. She asked questions. Sometimes she brought food, rice wrapped in banana leaf, salted eggs. She didn't come often, But when she did, they said the air felt colder, more aware of itself. The guards stiffened, the prisoners fell silent. And she always knew their names. No one could agree on what she looked like. Some said she was tall, others said small, bird-like. A few remembered her hands' long fingers, graceful, like a pianist, but everyone remembered the way she entered a room, quiet, unannounced, and yet somehow, everything in the space shifted. As if she brought with her the weight of every word she'd ever spoken over the airwaves. You imagined her sometimes, not in uniform, not in anger, but sitting cross-legged on a floor covered in old newspapers, headphones on, script in hand. You pictured her brushing hair behind her ear as she read out another name, another city, another truth that would rattle around inside your helmet for days. There was something else about the ones who had met her. A look in their eyes, not quite fear, not quite awe, as if they had seen the inside of something sacred and terrible. They didn't hate her, at least not the way you expected. One prisoner said she was the only person who treated him like he still had a name. He couldn't explain it, said it didn't make sense. But his voice cracked when he said it. You tried to imagine what it must have felt like to hear her speak not from a radio, but from 5 feet away. To look into the face that had haunted your nights and find not a monster, but a woman, breathing, watching, speaking softly. She never raised her voice, they said, not once, not even when a prisoner wept, not even when one screamed at her, spat at her, begged her to stop. She simply stood still, waited, then left. That was her strength, perhaps. Her silence, her knowing when not to speak. Most weapons explode. She didn't need to. She just lingered. There were whispers that she'd lost someone to the war. A brother, maybe, a lover, but no one knew for sure. You wonder if that loss was what gave her voice its edge, that invisible cut beneath the smooth surface. Because even when she said your name without malice, it hurt. Like being touched by something too intimate, too precise. The longer the war stretched, the more the stories tangled. Some said she regretted her broadcasts, others claimed she believed every word. A few swore she cried after every list of the dead. The truth was likely somewhere in between, the way it always is, but it didn't matter anymore. By then, the war had soaked into everything: boots, letters, dreams. She was part of the landscape now. When you came home, you thought she'd fade. Like the heat, like the sound of helicopters. But she didn't. You'd be walking past a storefront, hear the soft static of a distant speaker, and your gut would twist. Or you turn on the TV, and some documentary would play her voice again, restored, remastered, but unchanged. Thur Chong, you knew she survived the war. The reports confirmed it. She continued her work for years. Though the broadcast changed, peace came. Or what people called peace, but her voice never quite left the jungle. It lived there, curled among the roots and leaves, waiting for someone to remember. Some veterans kept tapes, hidden in boxes, beside medals and photos too painful to frame. You heard one once, played low on an old recorder. It crackled, hissed, then came alive with her opening line, "Hello, unknown American soldiers." She said it like a prayer, like she meant it. And in that moment, something inside you collapsed. Not from pain, from recognition, because part of you missed her. Missed the clarity she offered, even when it hurt. In a war full of chaos, her voice had been strangely constant. Like the moon, distant, cold, always watching. You never met her, never saw her face, but you carry her name still, not in anger, not even in fear, but in memory. Because she was the one enemy you couldn't fight. The one who never fired a shot, but left a scar anyway. On your skin, but somewhere deeper. Rain came hard that year, harder than before, like it had finally decided to speak after years of holding back. Not a drizzle, not a polite curtain. This was rain that carved shapes into soil, that drowned the last whispers of birds, that forced even the trees to bow. In the monsoon, even the war stepped aside. Boots sank deeper, footsteps slowed, and guns grew heavier with the soaked promise of another endless morning. You remember that season not for the fighting, though there was plenty of that. You remember it for the way sound moved through the water. Everything echoed. The artillery, the shouting, the sudden sharp silence that followed an explosion, all of it swirled with the downpour. The world had no edges then, just layers of wetness and memory. Somewhere in the middle of that wet season, someone found a rusted tape recorder tucked into a fallen hut near the perimeter. It was Vietnamese, but inside was a cassette marked with a single line in English, for the unknown. The handwriting was careful, almost delicate, as if whoever wrote it had no intention of hurrying, even while surrounded by collapse. No one wanted to play it at first. There were fears, booby traps, surveillance, something worse. But eventually curiosity won. It always did. Someone rewound the tape with a pencil, popped it into a spare machine, and pressed play. What came through wasn't just sound, it was something older, something quieter. Not Hannah this time, at least not in the way you'd known her. It was her? Yes, but stripped of her performance. No greetings, no lists of names, just humming. A soft melody, Vietnamese perhaps, or something improvised in the stillness of a studio between broadcasts. It drifted, mournful, barely formed, but undeniably human. She was humming like someone waiting for rain to stop, like someone remembering a lullaby sung to her in another war. No one spoke during that first listen. A few shifted in their chairs. Someone lit a cigarette. The rain outside pressed harder against the tent flaps. And her voice, wordless, disarmed, slipped past every defense. Because here was the enemy humming like a sister, like a stranger on the same long road. After that, the tape passed from hand to hand. It didn't circulate officially. No command approved it, but it moved anyway. One day you'd find it tucked inside a rucksack, the next week hidden inside a folded copy of Stars and Stripes. Some nights, it played softly in the background while someone cleaned his rifle or wrote a letter home. You didn't know if she meant for it to be found. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it was deliberate. Maybe she knew that sometimes the smallest cracks let in the most light. There's something war does to time. Days stretch long and indistinct, like wet rope, but moments, real moments, flash so bright they burn themselves into your ribs. That tape was one of them, not because it changed the war, but because it reminded you that the war, somehow, still included music. Later, back in the rear, someone claimed that the melody was based on a French tune, one popular during the First Indochina War. Others swore it was a lullaby called Our Yukon, something mothers still sang to children in the north. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it came from her. The voice, Hannah, Thur Chong. It was then that you began to think more deeply about what she represented, not just to you, but to the country around you. She wasn't a myth to them, she was a voice of resistance. A woman speaking in the tongue of her enemy, reshaping language into a kind of mirror. To Americans, she was psychological warfare. But to many Vietnamese, she was a symbol of fierce intelligence, of cultural subversion, of dignity under fire. And that made you wonder, had she always been a weapon, or had she simply refused to be silenced? One afternoon, while walking back from a checkpoint past a collapsed rice barn, you spotted something unusual. A small radio, hanging from a tree branch like an ornament. Its cord wrapped tightly around bark. No batteries, no sign of who left it. It had been left there deliberately, and beside it, nailed into the tree, was a faded photo of a woman speaking into a microphone, her eyes narrowed with calm intent. You stood there for longer than you meant to? The photo wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. You recognized her posture, her poise, her silence. War has a way of turning everything into theater. Guns into props, maps into illusions, people into roles they never auditioned for. But standing there, under dripping leaves and the distant sound of helicopters, you realized she hadn't played a role. She had owned it. Some called her a liar. Others said she was brave. In truth, she was both, as everyone in war must be. Truth isn't a straight line in places like that. It's a circle, a loop that returns to the same questions, over and over. Why are we here? Who decides the cost? Who gets remembered? The rain kept coming. During monsoon patrols, your world shrank to boots, breath, and rhythm. Each step a prayer not to slip, each breath a way to prove you were still alive. But always, her voice lingered, not the words anymore, but the cadence, the way she could hold a moment in suspension, just long enough for it to mean something. You began to wonder what happened to her in the silence after each broadcast. Did she step outside the studio and light a cigarette? Did she walk home alone, through Hanoi's quiet streets, under blackout skies? Did she wonder if anyone was listening, or did she know? Sometimes, during those long walks, you imagine her hearing your own thoughts, the way you once heard hers. Maybe the war had been a conversation all along, unequal, unwelcome, but undeniable, not between nations, between people. Between a soldier in the jungle and a woman behind a microphone, both of them waiting for rain to end. By the time that season closed, something in you had shifted, not because you agreed with her, but because you understood her weight, her presence. She had left fingerprints on your memories, not from touch, but from resonance, reverberation, the echo of things never quite said. Even now, decades later, in the silence between night sounds or in the sudden hush before a storm, you sometimes hear it again, not words, not music, but the shape of her silence. And somehow, that's what you remember most. Long after the war ended, long after the uniforms were boxed up and the medals quietly stored away in drawers, the letters began to arrive. Not in great waves, not in loud, patriotic ceremony. They came in slow trickles, tucked between bills, hidden under VA hospital appointments, wrapped in the quiet dust of memory. Most were anonymous. A few bore initials, one or two came on yellowed paper so thin you could almost see through them. All were from men who had survived a low prison known to most as the Hanoi Hilton. You never served time there yourself. You fought in the southern jungles, where leeches outnumbered enemy fire and the trees watched you breathe. But the letters came to all of you, scattered across stateside cities and rural towns, because the memories didn't belong to one place. They belonged to all of it, to the men who sat in muddy foxholes, and to those who sat alone in dark concrete cells. The letters weren't dramatic, not at first glance. Most began plainly: dates, locations, dear brother, or sometimes no greeting at all. But the weight in them was heavy. Some men spoke of the rats, how they learned to coexist with them as with old roommates. Others wrote of hunger, of the slow shrinking of their own bodies, of the silence that scraped louder than any scream. But almost all mentioned her, not Hanoi Hannah, the nickname slapped on her like a label on a milk carton. No, in these letters, she was always Thur Chiang, her real name, written respectfully, or warily, or with a strange nostalgia that surprised even the writers. She was remembered not just as the voice on the radio, but as something else, an echo that survived the noise. In the prison, her voice arrived through speakers rigged to the walls, tinny and distant. Sometimes it played once a week, sometimes more. Always in English, always calm, she spoke of anti-war protests, of fallen comrades, of mothers and fathers who wanted their boys home. She listed names, accurate ones, sometimes with hometowns of Americans newly captured or killed. No one knew how she got the information. Some said it was all made up, others weren't so sure. And then there were the poems. A few letters recalled her reading poems, Vietnamese verses, often untranslated. They arrived between the news reports, folded like leaves into the static. The men didn't understand the words, but the cadence was unmistakable, soft, unhurried, like rain brushing against steel bars. One former pal wrote that those verses were the first beauty he'd heard in months, that even if they were propaganda, they gave him something to hold onto besides silence. Still, others remembered her as cruel, not with threats, but with hope. She'd mention a soldier's hometown, then describe it as if she'd just walked through it, talking about how peaceful it looked, how quiet the streets had become. To a man starving in a windowless room, that was a weapon sharper than any blade. One prisoner described how she said his wife had remarried. He hadn't heard from her in 2 years, so he believed it. That night, he tried to hang himself with a shoelace. Another wrote that she once read a letter supposedly from his son, who'd been too young to write at the time. It was false, he knew that, but the sound of his son's name cracked something inside him that never quite healed. Even so, the bitterness in those recollections wasn't pure. It came mingled with a strange respect. Because even through lies, even through manipulation, her voice reminded them of something they had almost forgotten. The world still existed beyond those walls. Some claim she visited in person just once or twice. No guards, no threats, just a woman in a presto die, standing at the doorway of a holding cell, not speaking, just watching. A quiet force, wrapped in civility. No one knew if it really happened, or if the memory blurred in the heat of confinement. But they remembered her presence the way one remembers dreams, fuzzy at the edges, but too vivid to ignore. You didn't know what to make of it at first. How could the same woman who rattled your unit's nerves in the South also exist in the cracked memory of a northern prison? But war does that. It bends perception. It makes symbols of people, then ghosts of those symbols. Over time, Thur Chong became more than a name, more than a broadcast. She became a rhythm. A quiet drumbeat that stitched its way through minds pushed to the edge. One letter stayed with you. It came from a man named Carter, a pilot who spent nearly 7 years in HEA. He wrote with the plainness of someone who had nothing left to prove. No politics, no bitterness, just memory. He described the sound of rain hitting the corrugated roof of his cell, how it would sync with her voice when the broadcast came on. He didn't understand Vietnamese, but he said her tone changed during the poems, less sharp, more personal, like she wasn't reading for Americans at all, but for herself. For someone she'd lost, or someone she still hoped to find. He ended his letter with a single line, "I never saw her face. But somehow, I feel like she saw mine." You read that line again and again. It echoed, because, in the end, what those letters gave you wasn't clarity. It was texture. The war had flattened everything, made enemies simple, made memories monochrome, but the letters brought shades back. They made you see her not as an opponent, but as part of the landscape of that time, uncomfortable, undeniable, human. Years later, you found a photograph. A woman in a studio, one hand on her headphone, the other poised above a reel-to-reel machine. Her eyes were downcast, her mouth slightly open, caught mid-breath. It wasn't labeled, but you knew. You didn't frame it. You didn't tell anyone you had it. You slipped it between pages of an old notebook, where you kept the names of the men you served with, the ones who came home, and the ones who didn't. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, you'd take it out. Not to forgive, not to understand, just to remember. And in those moments, her voice came back, not loud, not commanding, but present. A frequency that lived somewhere between memory and myth. Not every enemy is a monster, and not every memory heals. But sometimes, the act of remembering is the only peace you ever find. You first heard her voice under the low canopy of a banyan grove, where the leaves held more than sunlight and the air smelled of gun oil and mildew. It was late January, 1968, and something about the forest felt wrong, too still, too quiet, like the jungle was holding its breath. You and the others crouched in what you were told was an abandoned village, listening to a rusted field radio, trying to catch signals through the static, when her voice slipped through. Not shouted, not sung, just a steady, breath-warmed cadence that folded itself between the trees. It was Thur Chong, the same one you'd first heard back in Da Nang, the same one you were warned about in boot camp, only now, it was personal. She spoke calmly, as always, but the message had changed. This wasn't the usual news of protests in Detroit or war widows in San Francisco. This was something else, closer. She listed unit numbers, actual ones. She spoke of troop movements. Then she named the village you were in, not the code name, the real name. the one etched in rotting wood above a half-collapsed well. And then she said, almost gently, that this was not your war to die in. That's when the whispers started. Men glanced sideways at each other. How did she know where we were? Was the radio bugged? Was someone in the unit leaking information? You remember that night because nobody slept, not from fear of the enemy, but from fear of something more intimate, being watched, being known. The jungle was no longer just a wilderness. It became an ear, a witness. Even the wind felt like it was listening. It was the beginning of TGT, the Vietnamese New Year. You had been told that there would be a ceasefire, that the fighting would pause for tradition, for reverence, but the rockets began falling before dawn. Hue was already burning. Saigon had been breached. And somewhere behind enemy lines, that voice continued, threading itself into the chaos. Her broadcast became something of a ritual during those days. You didn't try to listen. The radios just caught her frequency. As if she were broadcasting from inside the jungle itself. The trees seemed to carry her. The rivers, too. She wasn't just on the air. She was in the air. She talked about TGT not as a holiday, but as a rebirth, a turning point. She spoke of American boys losing limbs while old men back home debated strategy over steak dinners. She called it the great hypocrisy. She said America's problem wasn't the Viet Cong, it was the myth of its own righteousness. She made it sound like you weren't liberators, but guess who had overstayed? Some soldiers laughed her off, called her a wind-up doll for communism. Others cursed the radio, threw rocks at the speakers, covered their ears. But there were always a few who just listened, not out of agreement, not out of belief, but out of recognition. She knew too much, too many names, to many cities, to many hometowns. One night, during a rare lull in shelling, she read the names of 3 men in your platoon who died that week. She said their ranks, their birthplaces, then she paused. And instead of gloating, instead of spewing ideology, she said, their mothers will wake up tomorrow, not knowing they are gone. You didn't know what to feel. War trains you to harden, to keep lost compartmentalized. But in that moment, under that voice, something shifted. You saw one of the new guys barely 19 turn away and wipe his eyes. You said nothing. None of you did. But the air was different after that. You weren't just bodies in motion anymore. You were memories being written by someone else's voice. Over time, her broadcast took on the quality of a ghost story. You never saw her, you only heard. And yet, you imagined her everywhere, in the tree line, in the smoke, in the tremor just before a mortar strike. She began to haunt you, not like a villain, but like a memory you couldn't quite bury. You heard rumors that her real name wasn't Thur Chong at all, that she'd been educated abroad, that she'd spoken perfect French before perfect English, that her own brother had died in an American airstrike, and she'd never spoken of it again. Some said she hated what she did, that she cried after every broadcast. Others believed she was proud chosen, even. A weapon of soft war. You never knew the truth. But the possibility that both could be true stayed with you. That a voice could be both enemy and elegy. That a woman could mourn while speaking into your fears. During the monsoon weeks that followed, her voice became a strange comfort. Not because you believed her, but because she was consistent. When everything else was mud, blood, and fog, she was clear. Clearer than your officers, clearer than Washington. You never doubted she had a purpose, you just doubted yours. By the time you rotated out, the broadcast had become background noise, part of the landscape. You could almost predict her timing. Dawn, dusk, the hours when men were weakest. One last time, as you sat waiting for a chopper under a thin tarp, her voice drifted through a radio someone had left on. She said, "Even a tree, when cut, remembers the blade." Then the broadcast ended. You carried that sentence with you back home. It lived in the corner of your thoughts. You wrote it down once, in the margin of a used book. Years later, you found the book in a second-hand shop and froze when you saw your own handwriting. It reminded you that nothing stays buried. That memory has roots, and they grow in strange directions. You weren't alone in that. You met others men who had fought in Nkei, in Pleiku, in Khe-San, and they remembered her, too, some with contempt, some with longing. One man told you he couldn't listen to women's voices on the radio for years without flinching. Another confessed he had recorded one of her broadcasts, kept it hidden, and played it every anniversary of the Tet Offensive, not out of nostalgia, but as a kind of penance. There was something about her that never let go, not even now. You keep a map in your garage, pinned above your workbench. It's old, frayed at the edges. Vietnam's outline is faint, the borders faded like memory. But if you close your eyes, you can still hear the bamboo rustling, you can feel the rain on your helmet. You can hear a woman's voice in the ether, steady, precise, unwavering. She never told you what to believe, only what not to forget. There's a particular kind of silence that follows war. It's not peace, it's not relief. It's a silence that feels like static and settled, humming, waiting to resolve. When you came home, you found yourself inside that silence. Everything was still. The trees in Ohio didn't rustle the same way. The sky looked wrong. Even the wind felt counterfeit, like a staged version of something you once survived. You didn't talk about Vietnam, not at first, maybe not ever. The people at home didn't know what questions to ask, or maybe they didn't want the answers. So, you learned to wear your return like camouflage. You laughed at the wrong jokes. You stood still during the anthem. You told yourself you were lucky. You were breathing. You were whole, mostly, but some nights, in that flat, Midwestern dark, you'd hear it again, not a memory, not a dream, but her voice. Not loud, not clear, just the tone, the way she'd pause between words. The way she said America like it was both a question and a confession. You'd roll over in bed and stare at the ceiling, wondering how a voice that once made your blood boil now made your breath catch. She was never meant to follow you home, but somehow she had. You bought a shortwave radio at a flea market the summer after you returned. Told yourself it was for music, maybe foreign news, maybe just nostalgia. But sometimes, when the house was quiet and the static began to crackle, you turned the dial, half hoping to hear her again. You never did, but that didn't stop you from listening. And that's when it began, the realization that it wasn't just her voice you missed, it was what it represented. Not Hanoi, not communism, but clarity. In the jungle, everything had consequence. Every sound, every breath, every footstep had weight. Back home, it was all soft, vague. The questions felt smaller, but the answers were gone. You started noticing how certain sounds set you off. A woman's voice over a loudspeaker, a newscaster with the same calm, clipped cadence. Once, at a gas station, someone's car radio was playing an old French love song, and you froze. Not because of the song itself, but because it reminded you of the lull between her segments, that haunting pause that came right before she whispered your name, or your city, or your future. You told no one about this. What would you say? That a woman who tried to dismantle your morale had somehow become a thread in your internal wiring. That she knew you in ways your family never would. Years passed like wind through barbed wire, fast, then gone. The war faded into headlines, then textbooks. They called it a mistake. They called it a tragedy. They called it necessary. You nodded along, even when the words scraped wrong. You had nothing to add, only the static. You married eventually, raised children, worked, built fences. Taught your hands to forget. You told yourself that time had done its job. But memory is not a wound, it's a rhythm. A pulse beneath the skin. It does not vanish. It waits. Your kids never asked much. Once, your youngest brought home a school report about the Vietnam War and read aloud from her textbook. She said something about body counts and the Tet Offensive, then looked up at you with a question caught behind her teeth. You told her to finish her homework, and she did. But she never brought it up again. You wanted to say something, anything, but the words never arrived. Then, one autumn, you visited a war memorial in Washington. It was early, sparse, just the sound of birds and distant cars. You ran your fingers along the etched names, searching for the ones you'd carried with you, the ones she'd named, and that's when it hit you, not the grief, not the guilt, but the distance, the unbridgeable space between then and now. You closed your eyes and remembered her reading names like prayers, not shouted, not mourned, just spoken, like she was daring the jungle to forget, like she knew even the enemy deserved to be remembered. That voice had stretched across battlefields, but now it stretched across decades. A few feet away, a younger man knelt beside a name, his jacket read Afghanistan. Different war, different sand, but the same posture. You nodded at him, he nodded back. You didn't speak. You didn't need to. Later that week, you found yourself pulling an old box from the attic. Inside were photographs, a jungle hat, a rusted Zippo, a crumbling ration card, and a single reel-to-reel tape. No label, no markings. You didn't remember how you got it. Maybe you found it. Maybe someone gave it to you. You didn't even have the machine to play it anymore. But you held it like a relic. You imagined what it might contain: a broadcast, a poem, a list of names, or perhaps just the hiss of static, undecipherable, unresolved. You set it back down, carefully, as if it could still bruise. That night, you dreamed of a studio. It wasn't vivid, just impressions. Bamboo outside the windows, dust on the console, a single red light glowing above a door. She sat at the mic. Not young, not old. Her hands steady, her gaze distant. She didn't look at you. She didn't have to. You felt seen anyway. And just before you woke, she leaned forward, not to speak, but to listen. You sat up in bed, heart steady, eyes wet. It wasn't fear. It wasn't longing. It was the weight of unfinished sentences, of voices caught mid-breath, of memories refusing to fade. That morning, you drove out to the countryside. No destination, just open road, the fields gold with harvest, the radio low, the windows down. And somewhere between two counties, between the past and the present, the static came again. It wasn't her. You knew that. She was probably long gone, or hidden in some Hanoi apartment, her voice now silent, her broadcast folded into history. But the feel of her was there, in the static, in the rhythm, in the way memory repeats itself when no one's looking. You realized then that some frequencies never truly die. They drift, they wait, they embed themselves in the quiet. And when you're still enough, when the world hushes just right, you can almost tune in again. Not to her message, but to the space between the words. To the part of you she never stopped speaking to. It took you 40 years to return. Not because you were afraid, though fear had played its part, buried deep in the marrow of your waking life, but because you deconvinced yourself there was nothing left in that soil for you. You had placed Vietnam inside a locked chest of memory, sealed with ritual and denial, and told yourself it had no more voice. But the truth was, that voice had never stopped. It lingered in the static hum of midnight radios, in the rustle of leaves outside your window on windless nights, and most of all in the unfinished silence of a woman you never met, but who once spoke directly to something in you couldn't quite name. When the wheels of the plane touched down on the runway of Nui Bai International Airport, you felt a pressure in your chest that had nothing to do with altitude. Hanoi greeted you not with fire and fury, but with the bright confusion of life: motorbikes like schools of fish in motion, vendors beneath woven hats balancing baskets of fruit, and rows of colonial buildings painted the pale yellow of forgotten empire. You had prepared for memory, but not for the weight of the present moment. You carried no uniform, no medals, no claims, just a single bag, and inside it, an old photograph folded between 2 pages of a paper bag map guide. In the photograph were 4 boys in jungle gear, mud on their faces, sweat darkening their sleeves. You were the one standing apart, eyes not on the camera, but on something distant, already receding. That boy had left part of his voice behind in the jungle, and you'd come to see if it was still echoing through the airwaves. Your first inquiries brought shrugs, polite deflections, and the soft laughter of youth unfamiliar with war. Most locals had never heard of Hanoi Hannah. Even her real name, Thur Chong, meant nothing to hotel clerks and guides. It was only at a tea shop near Trick Beach Lake, after asking an elderly vendor who'd once worked for the Ministry of Culture, that you were given a name. Professor via a media historian now semi-retired, who might know something. You called him that evening and were invited for coffee the next morning. No questions asked. Professor V met you in a quiet cafe where the walls were lined with books and old propaganda posters curling at the corners. He spoke softly, with the deliberate cadence of a man used to shaping stories out of fragments. She was real, he said. She had studied in Paris, returned to Hanoi before the bombs, and began broadcasting in English shortly after the Gulf of Tonkin. Her programs were recorded in a windowless bunker under Kim Ma Street, behind thick doors and thicker intentions. Her voice, calm and melodic, was chosen as a weapon not to wound, but to whisper doubt into the hearts of soldiers like you. He told you she never married, that she stopped broadcasting in 1973, that she passed away in 1999 in a quiet room surrounded by books and tapes no one would play. Her archives, however, remained intact, gathering dust in a government media warehouse a few districts away. With the wave of his hand, he offered to take you there. The next day, beneath a drizzling sky, you walked through the doors of a pale concrete building that could have been anything: a school, a clinic, a ghost. Inside, the corridors smelled of old paper and rain. The archive room was small, almost humble, but the rows of beige boxes held a weight you felt in your bones. The professor handed you gloves and led you to a player so outdated it looked like an artifact. He showed you how to use it, then left you alone with the silence. The first tape you selected had a label written in fading ink. February 1968. Eat it. You fed the reel into the machine, held the headphones to your ears, and braced for something you didn't know how to name. At first, there was only static, the crackling sound of time itself, then her voice. Still calm, still smooth, still impossibly clear, she greeted you not as a foe, not as an object, but as a human being with a name, a town, a memory. To the soldier from Elyria, Ohio, she said, and you froze. Your heart slowed. She knew. She named your unit. She mentioned your brother. She said he had written, and that he wanted to know if you were safe. Your hands began to shake. You didn't remember crying, only that your eyes had flooded before you could blink, and something inside you, something long frozen, began to crack. She wasn't accusing. She wasn't gloating. She was simply speaking, reaching across jungles, oceans, decades, with words that made you feel both seen and pierced. You listened to for more reels that afternoon, and with each tape, more faces returned, men who died with nicknames on their tongues. Letters written but never sent, a song played on a harmonica near a dying fire. In one tape, she quoted Baldwin. In another, she spoke of Kent State. In a third, she read a list of American casualties and then let the tape spin on in silence for 30 seconds, daring the void to answer. Near the end of the day, you found a box marked unreleased -1972. Inside was a single tape. No script, just her voice, unfiltered. She sounded tired, and maybe, finally, unguarded. I don't know who I'm speaking to anymore, she said, not as a performer, but as a woman alone in a room, speaking to the walls. But I know you're still listening, and maybe, after everything, that matters more than anything else. You didn't move for a long time. That evening, you walked alone along the edge of Westlake. The sky was soft and gray, like wet ash. Children played near the water's edge, their laughter drifting like radio static across the dusk. You heard music from a rooftop nearby, modern, fast, full of life you didn't recognize, and yet, underneath it, like a ghost frequency, you imagined you heard her still, somewhere between language and memory. You flew home 3 days later, but something had shifted. The static wasn't so loud anymore. It didn't claw for attention. It hummed, quietly, like something settling into place. You brought the tapes with you not to play them, not right away, but to carry them, as proof, as memory, as a message that had never stopped searching for its listener. In the silence of the return flight, as the sky melted into soft darkness beyond the window, you closed your eyes not to forget, but to listen again. And this time, when the voice came, it wasn't hers, it was yours. You didn't open the box for 26 days. It sat on your desk, untouched, beside a half-full bottle of ink, an old dog tag with no chain, and a sketch of a helicopter one had drawn on a napkin in Da Nang. The box collected dust. You wiped the table, but never the top of the box. That would mean starting. That would mean remembering. You convinced yourself there was no urgency. You'd listen when it felt right. But it never did. Memory is rarely kind, and it never asks for permission. Some days, you opened the lid and stared at the reels without touching them. They looked ordinary, plastic, labeled in faded ink. But they were not ordinary, they were weight. You carried them room to room without playing a single one, as if proximity alone could prepare you. It was late when you finally played the first, after midnight, no one else awake. You turned off all the lights except one soft lamp. The machine long silent clicked once, hesitated, then began. The hum returned like breath returning to lungs. You flinched at the first burst of static, not because it startled you, but because it sounded familiar. Then her voice came, and time bent. She sounded exactly as you remembered. Not clearer, not older, just the same, the voice that once bled through the trees and crawled into your bones during jungle watches. Calm, deliberate, measured like a clock that never lost time. She quoted a writer you hadn't thought of in years. The words themselves meant less than the rhythm of her speaking. Her voice did not provoke, it invited. You closed your eyes and let it wash over you. You didn't cry. You didn't move. The moment folded in on itself and carried you somewhere warm and terrifying. That night, sleep did not come easily. When it did, it brought fragments, a wet boot slipping into thick mud, a rusted canteen rolling into a stream, the humming of a fan in a command tent just before a flare lit the sky. These weren't nightmares. They weren't stories, they were shapes, sounds, moments without narrative, stripped of cause and consequence. Just the body remembering. You woke up with a pain in your wrist. The kind of ache that used to come from gripping a rifle too tightly for too long. You hadn't felt that in decades. You sat on the edge of the bed until morning came. The second tape opened with a hiss like wind through grass. She didn't speak right away, just let the air breathe. Then she read poetry. Lorca, maybe, or someone like him. The words were foreign, but the rhythm was familiar, soft, heavy, like feet on wet earth. You couldn't understand the lines, but you understood the ache inside them. She paused often. Sometimes she sighed. Sometimes you thought you heard a chair creak. These were the parts you listened for, the sounds that weren't supposed to be there, the human interruptions. The proof that she wasn't a myth, that she had a body, that she existed in real time, just like you had. When the tape ended, you sat back and wrote the word quiet in your notebook. You underlined it twice. You began filling the notebook without planning to. At first, it was just observations, a description of the sky the morning you left for Vietnam, the shape of a friend's mouth as he fell, the way blood smells when mixed with rain. Then came the fragments, half sentences, unfinished thoughts, small confessions. One page, simply read. Sometimes I still feel the straps on my shoulders. Another, I don't know if I ever came home. You didn't write to be understood. You wrote because it kept the static from building. You wrote because something inside you had started humming again, and you needed to give it shape before it overtook the silence. The third reel was unlabeled, the tape itself worn thin at the edges. You played it on a day the rain never stopped. The sky stayed the color of bruises. Thunder rolled slowly across the valley. Her voice was different here, slower, lower, like someone talking to themselves. The broadcast tone was gone, no trace of mission or message. She spoke like someone who didn't know if anyone was listening anymore. And maybe she didn't care. Maybe it wasn't for you. Maybe it was for herself. There were long stretches where she said nothing. You didn't mind. You felt closer to her in those silences than in any speech. One silence lasted over a minute. You timed it? You didn't breathe the entire stretch. When she returned, she didn't explain the pause. She just continued, softer now. Her voice trembled once, and it broke something in you. Not pain, not grief. Just something rigid inside you softened. You let it. You had the tapes digitized out of practicality. The transfer shop smelled like plastic and lemon oil. The boy behind the counter wore headphones and moved like someone who had never been lost. You said little. When he handed you the flash drive, he smiled politely. You left quickly. The digital files were clean to clean. Her voice sharp, trimmed, efficient. The silences compressed, the breath sanitized. You heard everything but felt less. The warmth of the machine hum was gone, so were the imperfections. And it was the imperfections that made it real. You returned to the analog player the next night. The hiss welcomed you back like an old friend. You played the second tape again. This time, her pauses lingered longer. Or maybe you just noticed them more. You didn't press rewind when it ended. You just sat in the after sound, writing the word weight in the corner of your notebook. The envelope arrived in early May. No sender. Postmarked Hanoi. Inside, a small note card. No date. No introduction. Just your name, written in careful ink. And below it, the one who listens through the noise. You stared at it for a long time. You didn't feel surprise. You didn't feel fear. You just felt known. You slipped the card between 2 pages of your notebook. On the left, a sentence about sandbags. On the right, a half-drawn sketch of a jungle clearing. Later that night, you played the first reel again. Only the beginning, just enough to hear her inhale before speaking. That breath was everything. That breath had always been everything. You turned off the machine before she spoke. You left the room without turning off the light. You wanted her to know you were still listening. You didn't call it a ritual, not at first. It began as an instinct, a quiet leaning toward repetition, and soon enough the shape of your evenings changed. The hour arrived with the same gravity each night, the sun beginning its descent behind the slats of the blinds, the weight of the air cooling on your shoulders, the silence of the house deepening in anticipation. You walked slowly to the room, the one you had cleared weeks ago, where the floor had become a stage for listening and the walls had absorbed 1,000 hours of sound. You did not need to decide which reel to play. Your hands reached without thought, fingers grazing the worn labels, choosing not by memory, but by magnetism. The machine awaited without impatience, its switch familiar, its motor obedient. You sat cross-legged on the mat, candlelight low and trembling, and you pressed play with the reverence of someone lighting incense at an altar. Her voice rose from the static like mist from warm earth, and your breath aligned to its rhythm, pulling you gently into that old gravity that never fully released you even decades after the last round had been fired, even after the uniforms were folded and forgotten. You never considered why you listened. You didn't frame it as penance or nostalgia, nor therapy or obsession. The act existed apart from interpretation. It was enough to sit and receive. Enough to let the voice pour into the quiet, to let the tape hiss fill the corners of your mind that had dried out from disuse. She spoke of things that now had no bearing, were updates from decades past, poetry read in slow, careful cadence, philosophical reflections as fragile as glass, yet in her tone there was no expiration. She had never rushed, never pleaded, never tried to convince you of anything. That was what made it matter. She had offered herself to the void, and you had met her halfway. Each pause she left between words became a space in which you could finally rest, and you noticed that the body you carried, once always braced for impact, began to soften in the pauses, began to listen in a new way, not just with ears, but with the memory of touch of dust of years. You found yourself writing more, not narratives, not even entries, just impressions. One line read, There are mornings when the birds outside sound like helicopters arriving too late. Another, I forget the names, but never the weight of the bodies we carried. Sometimes you wrote just to feel the pen press paper, to make marks as proof that you were still capable of putting shape to the intangible. Pages filled with half-thoughts, smudged fingerprints, moments that refused to expand into stories. You began cataloging sensations: the crack of wet bamboo, the smell of rice ash, the heat behind your ears on the day you walked past the child who did not cry. Nothing linear, nothing finished. The notebook had become a parallel tape, spooling out what the reels awakened. You left the journal open more often than not, on the desk near the window, so it could receive whatever thoughts surfaced. You began to add small drawings: a soldier's boot print, a lopsided campfire, the curve of her initials imagined on a broadcast sheet. These were offerings to a silence that never asked for them, but somehow honored them all the same. One evening, a new reel arrived in the mail, unmarked and unexpected. There was no return address, just your name in a handwriting that leaned slightly right, familiar in a way that disoriented you. You waited 3 nights before playing it, afraid that whatever lived on that tape would alter what you had built. When at last you listened, the reel began not with voice, but with silence, then breathing, and then the creak of a chair. No performance, no preface. She began reading something in French, low and slow, the words drifting into one another like smoke. You didn't understand a single sentence, and it didn't matter. What mattered was the presence behind the syllables, the pauses shaped by thought, the sound of vulnerability not masked but magnified. She coughed once, softly. She laughed, barely. Those two small, unscripted sounds lingered longer than all her rhetoric. It occurred to you that this tape had never been meant for an audience. It was not propaganda. It was human. It belonged to a night when she was perhaps tired, or lonely, or simply existing in her own stillness. You heard it, and felt for a moment that she had crossed not only miles, but years, just to keep your silence company. You stopped playing tapes for a week. Not from aversion, but from fullness. You walked instead, long circuits through streets where no one noticed you, past storefronts closed early, past lamplight falling over concrete like pale memory. The sound of her voice no longer required a machine. You heard it in the soft brush of your steps, in the rhythm of your breath, in the sigh of trees remembering wind. She had etched herself into your senses. You weren't haunted, you were tuned. Even the rustle of grocery bags in the kitchen, or the faraway call of a bird at dusk, seemed to arrive through the same filter of her tone, that intimate steadiness, that refusal to hurry. One morning, you turned the radio onto static and found comfort in it, as if the voice might thread itself through the noise again and say your name, just once, just to prove she remembered. Eventually, the machine failed to start. You tried cleaning the heads, checking the wiring, replacing the plug. Still nothing. You did not panic. You did not rush. You simply sat beside it, letting your fingers rest against its shell as if to thank it for its service. You placed the reels back in their box, wrapped them in the same cloth you had used for your rifle once, and stored them beneath the floorboard. Not hidden, preserved. The ritual had outgrown its tool. You sat in the room the next night as usual, without sound, without light, and waited, and the memory came anyway. The voice moved through you, the ritual now embedded in bone, no longer needing the invitation of buttons or reels. It had become a second language, a nightly tide that knew when to rise. You began to write again that evening. One sentence only. She is no longer a voice. She is a frequency I carry. Now, when night falls, you no longer light the candle, you no longer enter the room. The ritual follows you, it breathes with you. You write when the breath calls for it, you walk when the stillness begins to ache. You close your eyes and the silence speaks in her voice, never commanding, never gone. You understand now that she was not trying to change your mind. She was trying to keep you from disappearing. And through her voice, you have not. This is not nostalgia. This is not mourning. This is not madness. This is the ritual of listening, alive even when the tape no longer turns. It began with the rain, not the kind that drums with urgency, but the kind that hovers a curtain drawn gently across the edges of the world. It arrived before dawn and remained all day, a presence rather than a weather event, brushing lightly against the windows, turning the light silver, softening the outlines of things. You woke with the sense that the world was being filtered through gauze. The day moved slowly, without definition. You did not feel compelled to go outside or speak or check the time. Instead, you returned to the room without the machine, the one that still bore the weight of sound, though nothing now played within it. You sat cross-legged, not in ritual, but in stillness, as if the room had become a container for breath. There was no candle, no reel. There was only the rain, and in the folds of that rain, her voice returned, not spoken, but felt, not broadcast, but remembered. The tapes had ended, but she had not. Her voice had become something less directional, more ambient, a current in the atmosphere. You no longer needed to recall specific messages or moments. Instead, entire states of being arrived, ushered in by soundless echoes. The smell of water on dry concrete conjured the cadence of her closing words. The clink of a spoon in a glass unearthed the long pause before her sign-off. She was in the rhythm of objects, in the intervals between events. Memory had never been so quiet, and never so complete. You spent hours that day leafing through your notebooks. Some pages you had no memory of writing. Others felt like echoes of a self you no longer inhabited. You read a passage that described a field covered in mist, bodies half buried in stillness, and realized you hadn't seen such a field in over 40 years. Yet you could smell the earth again. You could feel the weight of the canteen strap across your chest. The memory did not come in images, but in temperature, texture, tension. As if her voice had taught you to access recall through the skin rather than the mind. The rain had coaxed out a kind of listening that bypassed hearing altogether. Later, you moved to the living room and sat in your old chair, the one that faced the window. You did not turn on the lamp. The gray light was enough. The house felt held by the weather, and you, in turn, were held by the house. The quiet was not absence. It was presence redistributed. She was not gone. She had simply changed forms. Somewhere between static and rain, she had dispersed into the fabric of the world. And as you sat there, a realization came, soft and total, that you were no longer the listener. You were the medium. Her words had etched themselves so deeply into you that they now spoke through you. Every act of stillness, every slow exhale, every scribbled note, every glance toward the window was a reply. You were not alone in the ritual, you had become it. That night, the dreams came in waves. You did not sleep in images, but in impressions. You felt a presence sit beside you, not threatening, not known. You felt the press of humid air against your collarbone, the creak of floorboards beneath someone else's step. You heard a voice without language, just breath, just rhythm, just the suggestion of being witnessed. When you woke, the room still held the dream's texture. You moved slowly through the morning. The rituals of coffee, of folding the blanket, of setting the chair straight again, all done with the same quiet care you once gave the tapes. Everything was touched with significance, not nostalgia, not longing, but continuity. The world had not returned to you, you had returned to the world. In the days that followed, the writing changed again. You no longer wrote as recollection, you wrote as transcription. As if her thoughts passed through you, and your pen merely recorded them. They weren't her words, not exactly. But they carried her cadence, her restraint, her clarity. One line read, "You don't survive silence." You join it. Another, "The war inside the body lasts longer than the one in the field." You read these back and did not recognize them as yours, and yet you did not question them. They belonged. They had found their home in your notebook, and in doing so, had stitched another line between you and that voice. You found yourself drawn back to the radio. Not the modern one, but the old box in the garage, dusty, wheezing, worn. You cleaned it gently, not with the urgency of hope, but with the tenderness of memory. You turned it on, static, then faint whines, then silence. You tuned the dial with the same care you once gave the reels. A frequency emerged, not words, not music, but tone, a low hum that vibrated in the bones of your hands. You did not need to understand it, you simply listened. And as you listened, you felt her again, not close, not far, just everywhere. The rain ended 3 days later, but its echo remained, in puddles that reflected the sky without distortion, in leaves that dripped long after the clouds had left, in the way the air still tasted like arrival. You did not chase her voice anymore, you had integrated it. Her frequency lived now beneath your own, quiet, steady, certain. You spoke less to others, but more to yourself, not aloud, not in words, but in awareness. In the pause before reply, in the choice not to rush, in the knowing that you were always being listened to, even in silence. This was not healing. Healing implies an end. This was resonance. A life rearranged to accommodate what it once tried to escape. The war did not leave you, but it no longer led you. Her voice did not save you, but it reminded you how to stay. And now you live in that remembrance, not as a monument, but as an instrument, tuned, ready, whole in a way that no tape, no uniform, no country ever made you. It began not with rain, but with light, a pale spill across the wall that you didn't notice until the shadows moved. Morning had arrived without drama. There were no sharp sounds, no ticking clocks, no insistent demands. Just the slow diffusion of color across plaster, and a breeze through the window that carried nothing but itself. You rose without thinking. The body moved of its own accord. No hunger, no urgency, no destination. You stood at the threshold of the hallway, the notebook still open on the desk behind you, last night's entry already flaking at the edges. Something in you remained in the space of the dream, not asleep, not awake, moving as if through water. You made tea and didn't drink it. Let it cool beside the sink. You placed your hands on the counter and let them rest there, watching the steam fade. Time became irrelevant, not slow, not fast, just uncounted. You returned to the room that had once held the machine, but this time not to listen, not to write. Simply to sit, not cross-legged, not formal, not arranged. You sat as you might have sat in a field long ago, the weight of a helmet in your lap, the sun pressing your back, the world indifferent to your presence. And in that quiet, she returned again, not with a voice, not with sound, but with awareness. She arrived now as recognition, not memory, not echo, but the awareness that you had never really stopped listening, that everything in your life had been quietly adjusted by the knowledge of her presence, even when the tapes were gone, even when you forgot the sound of her vowels. You live now with the shape of her breath in the rhythm of your days. When you turned the page, when you stirred the pot, when you passed someone on the street and did not speak, the silences you left behind were no longer empty. They were carried outside. The season shifted. The trees lost their urgency. The birds grew quieter. Even the wind took longer to pass through the yard. You noticed these things not as changes, but as confirmations. The world, too, had entered a quieter chapter. You walked less often, but when you did, your path curved more than it used to, detouring toward nothing in particular, lingering near stone walls, stopping before doorways that no longer opened. The world felt curated, not by will, but by patience. You allowed the world to arrive at its own pace. No longer pressing, no longer retreating, just present. There was no destination, only experience, only the quality of presence. Your journal began to fill again, but differently. Less with thoughts, more with observations, a pattern in the floorboards. The way dust gathered in corners like punctuation. The sound of your own breath when the fridge shut off. You were no longer searching for meaning, only marking presence. You wrote not to remember, but to notice. Each line was an act of companionship with the room, with the air, with whatever remained of her in the folds of your memory. You wrote, and the pen moved slowly, as if it had been trained by her voice. Occasionally, a sentence would emerge so clearly that it seemed to arrive fully formed, as if dictated by something just beyond language. The quiet is not an absence. One entry began, but a canopy under which the lost make their shelter. In time, you came to accept that she had changed your grammar. Not just the grammar of words, but of attention, of waiting, of being. You no longer filled silence, you partnered with it. You no longer corrected the past, you allowed it. Her broadcasts, once weapons of information, had become invitations to stillness, and you had accepted. Long after the war, long after the voices stopped transmitting, you had found a way to live as if her station still existed. Somewhere beyond the reach of antenna, outside the grasp of tape, within the atmosphere of your body, a quiet signal, unwavering. It was in the shuffle of your slippers, the crack of the wooden step, the sigh you made before closing the door. It was not performative, it was foundational. Sometimes, you imagined her old studio, the microphones, the dusty clocks, the engineers with tired faces. You imagined her waiting before she spoke, letting silence frame the sentence. You wondered if she'd ever listen back to her own voice, if she'd heard in it something unresolvable. You hoped she had moments of stillness, of breath, of ritual, not because she needed them, but because she gave them, and those who give ritual deserve its return. You imagined the way her hands moved as she adjusted her notes, the way she might have looked out the window and watched the same kind of slow light move across her own city walls. In the mirror of her silence, you saw your own face returning to itself. Now, you rise and sleep without prompting. You do not measure the days, you live them. The world does not call for you, it receives you. You have become someone who no longer looks for resolution. You have outgrown conclusions. You have, in the deepest way, returned not to a place, but to a way of being. She has become part of your return, not a guide, not a ghost, a presence. A tone that harmonizes with the quiet you've made room for. You walk the perimeter of the house and find no fences, you look inward and find no war. The tape is long gone, but the frequency remains, and so you move in tune with it, without beginning or end, only cycles, only resonance. Not closure, continuation. Later that evening, you stepped outside just as the sky turned violet. A neighbor's dog barked once, distant, inconsequential. The gravel shifted beneath your feet as you walked to the end of the garden where the boundary met a line of trees. You touched one of the trunks and closed your eyes. In the texture of bark, you felt the grooves of an old transmission. In the breath of wind, the shape of a voice that once stitched itself into the fabric of air. And as you stood there, neither seeking nor retreating, you realized this was the final form of her message. Not content, not language, but presence. Not volume, but vibration. Not history, but enduring attention. The season tipped again, not with sudden cold or a storm, but with a quiet ripening. Leaves curled inward on their stems. Apples fell without sound. The air turned from weightless to woolen, wrapping the bones of the house in invisible cloth. You noticed it first in the way your joints ached after sleep, the way the sunlight shortened its arc across the living room rug. This was the part of the year where nothing announced itself, but everything shifted. You followed the changes like footsteps in dry grass. No trail, only texture, only clues. You moved slower, leaned into your surroundings as if the walls could speak. And they often did softly, through creaks, through smells, through patterns of shadow that bent like breath on old glass. Your writing slowed, not for lack of thought, but because the thoughts came now with such density that they resisted capture. Each word had to be earned, not taken. You sat with the page longer, listened more than you wrote. There were hours where the pen hovered just above the line, waiting for the sentence to land fully formed. Sometimes it never did, but the wait itself became the point. The space between attempts was not silence. It was gathering, a harvest of attention. Like crouching in a rice field, watching the stalks bend, letting the moment pass over you instead of rushing to pluck it from time. This new patience wasn't a performance, it was a deep, necessary breathing. Outside, the garden surrendered itself, vines withered with grace. Weeds reached upward in final flourishes before frost. There was a kind of dignity in their decline. No pleading, no resistance, just completion. You walked through the remnants each afternoon, one slow lap at a time, as if memorizing the contours of loss. The soil, once fragrant with ambition, now held a different kind of scent, earthier, settled, honest. You took nothing from it. Not even a photograph. Memory would suffice. And memory, you had learned, was more reliable when untethered to proof. You no longer needed evidence to trust what was felt. You no longer checked the weather. You let the world tell you what it was through the breath of the windows, the creak of the steps, the behavior of birds. Even the dogs seemed to move differently now, less barking, more watching. There was a shared understanding between you and the creatures of the yard, the language of persistence, of staying, of witnessing things not for their usefulness, but for their being. You no longer rushed from task to task. You performed them with a kind of reverence, as if each action, a pot rinsed, a curtain drawn, was an offering, a gesture of understanding toward the quiet rhythm that had settled in you. One morning you woke with the image of a helmet in your lap. You hadn't seen one in decades, but there it was in your dream, dented, dusty, undeniably yours. You felt the weight of it long after waking. Not fear, not regret, just weight. The kind that memory wears when it no longer needs to explain itself. You did not write about the dream. You didn't need to. It was enough to have received it, like a broadcast from a far station that came clear for just a moment and then receded again into static. You folded the image carefully and placed it among your breath. You made no shrine of it. You let it live where dreams rest after meaning has dissolved. The tapes were gone? Yes, but the listening remained. It had matured, ripened. You no longer sat by the window waiting for her voice. Instead, you let the world speak in her cadence. The flap of a tarp, the hum of a faraway truck, the echo of your own footsteps on the porch. She had become a frequency not tied to sound, but to stillness. A way of hearing what did not ask to be heard. You no longer needed her words to know what she meant. You had become fluent in the pauses. You carried her not as memory, but as muscle, something inside you that now knew how to wait, how to attend, how to shape presence from absence. In your notebooks, new entries appeared almost without you. They arrived not as thoughts, but as residues, fragments of tone. Lines like, "Even ghosts must eat sunlight," or, "What falls remembers the sky." You did not question them. They required no origin story. They belonged. And you began to see that you too belonged again, not to a role or a flag, but to the act of witnessing. You were no longer a soldier, not even a survivor. You were a participant in the quiet, a cultivator of aftermaths. These phrases, like seeds, did not grow immediately, but you knew they held something. And that was enough. The days shortened further. Nights came gently but stayed longer. You slept more, but lighter. Dreams lingered at the edge of waking, not vivid, just present. You moved slowly through them as you did through your mornings, soft-footed, curious, unhurried. You took to sitting by the fire, not for warmth but for the movement of the flame. It reminded you of broadcasts, constant, flickering, needing no response, just attention. The sound of the fire was its own language, crackling with the same uncertain rhythm that once laced her voice on cold nights when your breath fogged the inside of your helmet and the jungle never stopped humming. By now, her voice was no longer separate from your own. When you hummed to yourself in the kitchen, when you closed the window with care, when you watched a crow strut along the fence, you carried her, not as a relic, not as a wound, as a rhythm. And in that rhythm, you harvested something deeper than survival. You harvested presence, no longer caught between remembering and forgetting. You had stepped into a third state, inhabiting. And the silence, once feared, now offered sustenance. You had returned to the field, not in body, but in spirit. And this time, there was no battle, only stillness, only soil. Only the long breath of something healing in its own time. It begins with breath, not yours, but the house's, a slow inhale that moves through the hallway, beneath the doors, along the windowsills, lifting the curtains just enough to remind you that the world is still breathing beside you. It exhales without sound. You stand in the center of it, still in your socks, holding nothing, needing nothing. The clock ticks, the air holds. Something ancient is being recalled not to the mind, but to the body. You feel the return before you can name what has come back. It's not a voice, it's a sensation. A tone vibrating just beneath the audible range, like a memory that has grown legs and is walking beside you now. You carry it through the kitchen, the hallway, into the room where the light angles just right in the late part of day. There is no need to search for anything anymore. The searching phase is over. You're in the phase of recognition, of turning gently toward what was always there, just outside the frame of your attention. That sensation lives in the corners now, at the edges of tasks. When you wash your hands, when you wind the clock, when you reach for the old coat and feel, beneath the fabric, the trace of something unspoken. This is how she lives now. Not on tape, not on a page, in the hush between chores, in the stillness after setting down a cup, in the breath you forget you're holding when the sun paints stripes across the old floorboards. Hannah, or what you called her, is no longer a person, but a field, something you move through, something that reacts to your presence not with speech, but with temperature, with weight. You notice your own movements change in response. You pause more. You bow your head when passing through doorways. You lay your hand on objects before using them, as if thanking them for waiting. Her presence is not nostalgic, it is instructive. It calibrates how you touch the world, outside. The fields are bare now. The final leaves hang not out of defiance, but in ceremony. The wind moves through them like a musician testing a familiar song. You walk the path behind a house and let your feet crunch the frost-kissed soil. This used to be the sound of winter drills, of boots at dawn, of urgency. Now it is an instrument you play slowly, deliberately. Each step a note, each pause a rest. You've become a listener in your own life. In the absence of combat, you've become fluent in the cadence of presence. This was her gift, training not for battle, but for reception. The notebook on your desk has grown thick. Its pages are filled not with stories, but with traces. You no longer write conclusions. You write echoes. You've learned to trust that not everything must be said for it to be known. One page simply reads, "I saw the shadow of her voice across the wall." Another, "Rain does not ask permission to fall." A third, written in the margins, says only, "She spoke in thresholds." There are days when you feel yourself vanish, not in despair, but in alignment. You become the warmth in the chair, the pressure in the floorboard, the breath in the window pane. You find no loss in it. You become part of the materials around you. And this is what she offered you: not clarity, not answers, but the ability to blur gently into the fabric of what is. In war, you were defined by edges. Now, you are welcomed by contours. To live like this is not resignation, it is reverence. She gave you that framework, and now you live within it, wordless and precise. You return to your fire in the evenings, not to recall, but to participate. The flame rises and falls without agenda. You mirror it in posture, in pace, in thought. It asks nothing and gives everything. The radio sits silent beside you, no longer a portal, but an artifact. A reminder that once, someone reached across oceans with nothing but breath and courage, and that you received it not as a soldier, but as a soul. You hold that act in your chest like a lantern, flickering, enduring, small but unwavering. Some nights, you hear her, not in sound, but in action. The way you close the curtain, the way you turn the handle on the kettle, the way you leave the light on longer than needed. These are transmissions now. This is how her broadcast continues, not through tapes, but through you, through every act of grace you learned in the aftermath, through every softness you cultivated in the years since the noise stopped. You've become your own station, your own signal, humming low, barely audible, but undeniably present. You carry a frequency, you walk in wavelength. You inhabit resonance, you don't speak of it to others. There are no veterans' meetings, no folded flags, no long retellings of events. You've realized that what you endured was never meant to become language. It was meant to become attention, to make you capable of stillness, to teach you the skill of staying. She helped with that, not as an enemy, not as a savior, as a frequency. You tuned in, and you've stayed tuned, even now, in the slow hours, in the long afternoons where nothing happens. You find her still woven into the structure of your being. In the hush after the kettle whistles, in the dust motes suspended in morning light, in the way you hold yourself open to a world that has long stopped explaining itself. When the first snow falls, you don't react. You watch it accumulate on the porch rail, soft and slow. You place your hand there and feel the cold bite. It reminds you of the night jungle, of the way time thickened around you back then. But this is not fear. This is not the return of pain. This is presence, softened, memory allowed to settle, like snow, into the corners of your being. You brush your hand across the railing and leave no mark. The snow continues to fall, and you let it. As you let all things now, without defense, without label, without the urge to retell, just snow, just breath, just listening, you begin to feel time not as movement, but as pressure. A slow, inward push that shapes your days from the inside, not by clock or sun, but by weight. Mornings arrive without rush, and you meet them as you would an old friend at the door, without need, without preparation. The coffee brews slower now. You don't count the seconds, you listen to them gather. Even the smallest things seem luminous, the way the window fogs, the curve of steam rising from the cup, the warmth that settles in your chest not from caffeine, but from the act of noticing. In these moments, the present ceases to be something you enter, it becomes something that surrounds you, cradles you, accepts you as part of its own still rhythm. The house has grown more silent, but not empty. The silence is inhabited. You feel it move like a tide through the rooms, touching everything with gentleness. It doesn't demand attention, it rewards it. You don't speak aloud anymore, not even to yourself. Language feels excessive, like paint on a sculpture that needs no color. You find yourself responding to the house with touch instead of sound, your hand on a windowsill, your fingertips brushing the wood of the stair rail, the way your palm holds the kettle before it boils. Everything is a gesture now. Nothing is wasted. Even the smallest motion feels like a kind of offering, a ritual performed not for anyone else, but for the continuity of being. The notebooks have multiplied. Some contain only fragments, one word, a symbol, a trace line of a thought that refused to take shape. Others are nearly blank, the silence on the page a kind of confidence. You've stopped worrying about form. You no longer chase cohesion. You let the pages be what they are, containers for whatever arrives. One entry reads, simply, light remembers. Another, what you tends you. A third appears suddenly in your mind as you move the pen without thinking. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of attention. You write them as if sending messages to a future version of yourself who will understand in ways you do not yet need to. The air outside smells of wood smoke and damp leaves. You walk each afternoon to the same spot by the edge of the woods where the trees open just enough to let you sit in a cradle of quiet. There is no bench, just earth, no markers. Just the way the light folds around your body. You sit there and listen to the world without expectation. Wine passes through the high branches. Once, a fox crossed your path and paused long enough to meet your gaze. Neither of you flinched. This, too, was a kind of frequency. In that space, you feel your pulse slow, as though sensing itself to the unhurried pace of root and moss and drifting cloud. You stay longer each time, not out of necessity, but because you are learning what it means to truly remain. At night, you return to your rituals, a candle lit on the windowsill, the slow turning of pages in a book you never finish, the hum of the radiator coming to life like an old friend stirring from sleep. You lie on the couch and feel yourself become weightless, not from detachment, but from clarity. You no longer hold your body the way you used to. There's a softness in your bones now, as if your frame had agreed to carry less, and in that lessness, you find room. Not absence capacity, not emptiness readiness. The shape of your life has become porous, allowing meaning to drift in and out like mist through cracked panes. You don't remember the last time you dreamed in images. Now your dreams are places, not visions, but sensations. A texture underfoot, a warmth at your side. The feeling of someone sitting to lust out of you, and you wake not startled, but cradled. You carry that presence with you throughout the day. Not haunting, companioning. Whatever ghosts remain have taken on new forms not of the past, but of persistence. Their job is no longer to remind you, it is to accompany you, a quiet fidelity. They are not weights, but shadows, gentle, patient, and constant. One morning, you light the radio again not for sound, but for memory. You turn the dial slowly, knowing nothing will answer, but letting your hand make the movement anyway. It feels right, this gesture. You hold the dial at the place where her voice once rose through static. And for a moment, you feel it the echo, not in sound, but in pulse. Something familiar expands in your chest. She's not gone. She's been transfigured. Into rhythm, into pause, into the very act of listening that you've made a life of. That is where she lives now, not in tape, not in war, but in the quiet you have chosen to tend. This is no longer about remembrance, about presence. You are not remembering her, you are being with her. You stop marking the calendar. Dates mean less now than seasons. You track time by the tilt of light, the shift in birdsong, the way your footsteps sound on the gravel, and in that rhythm, you find peace. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of harmony. Even your breath feels orchestrated. A slow inhale that joins the rustle of trees, the settling of dust, the long exhale of the world making space for itself. You no longer measure your days in accomplishments. You measure them in attention, in quiet acts of reverence, in moments when everything aligns not for meaning, but for stillness. You don't need closure, that word feels foreign now, to round, to final. You prefer continuation, not an end, but a soft loop. Like waves, like flame, like static, you live in the ongoing. In the dusk that never quite turns to dark, in the repetition of small acts lighting a fire, steeping tea, brushing lint from your sleeve. These are your broadcasts now. These are your transmissions. This is the signal you tend, the station you've become. When the sun drops below the trees and the room fills with that last amber light, you sit without moving. No music, no thought, just breath and wood and the shape of shadows growing longer across the floor. And in that moment, everything you were and everything you've become meets without friction. It is all still here, war, voice, silence, healing, not layered, not sequenced, simultaneous. You feel it press gently against your chest, not to take, not to remind, only to reside. This is not memory, this is resonance. There is no beginning anymore, only continuations. The days no longer introduce themselves with ceremony. They unfold like waves on a quiet shore, coming forward not to announce, but to remind. You wake with the light already inside the room, not entering it, but already a part of its tone. The bed breathes beneath you, the floor cool against your feet. No alarm, no task, just presence, and in this presence, everything becomes available. You do not seek out the meaning of morning, it comes to you gently in the steam rising from your mug, in the sound of crows lifting off from the bare branch, in the slow return of heat to your hands. This is not habit, it is devotion disguised as routine. You have not fallen into this rhythm. You have chosen it, moment by moment, until it became a second skin, and that skin is not armor. It is membrane porous, sensitive, alive to the world's breath. You have stopped naming the seasons. There are too many subtle versions of each now. The season of frost but not snow. The season of softened light before green. The season of earth loosened but not ready. You do not rush to mark them. They announce themselves in the small adjustments your body makes. The sweater kept near the door, the lengthening of sleep, the shift in your appetite, from salt to sweetness, from warmth to freshness. Each change is small, but it carries the whole of your attention. You do not catalogue, you witness, you stay, and each noticing adds a stitch to the quiet fabric of your existence. The seasons become not periods of time, but states of presence, each one teaching you a new way of being still. Even the way the shadows fall has become a form of calendar. Not to plan, but to belong. The radio remains silent. You dust it once a week as if tending to a shrine. Not for function, but for memory. Its dial still holds your fingerprints. Sometimes you turn it on, not expecting sound, but as a gesture of continuity. The act of reaching, of tuning, of remembering how to wait. The static is familiar now, almost comforting. In it, you hear the distance between signals, the breath before the voice, the possibility of reception, even if none arrives. This, too, is a kind of listening. This, too, is presence. Sometimes you sit with it for long minutes, hand resting on the warm metal, as if expecting her to speak again, but she doesn't need to. Her silence has become part of the room's structure, a quiet echo that lingers in the corners, woven into the dust motes that catch the late light. The silence is no longer void, it is archive, it is cathedral. It holds not just her memory, but the shape of your attention trained on it. You have stopped imagining what she looked like. The voice was always the face. And now, even the voice has become more texture than tone. She lives in the grain of the wood beneath your fingers, in the slant of the sun across the hallway floor, in the hush of early evening when the wind rests between trees. She is no longer a person, she is a rhythm you have learned to move with. Not following, not leading, simply aligned. Her legacy is not in the message, but in the listening she taught you to protect. She is a resonance that asks for nothing but attention. She is the memory of something that once shaped you and now rests inside you as stillness. You realize you are not mourning her, you are keeping cadence with her. And that's a different kind of devotion. There are fewer visitors now, you do not resist this. Your life is not built for conversation anymore. It is shaped for quiet. When someone comes, they enter gently. Their voices drop, their bodies slow. They sense the tuning of the space, they match it. And when they leave, you do not feel absence, only return. You light a candle, you steep tea, you sit. The room closes gently around you again, not in retreat, but in completeness. This is the peace you have cultivated, not silence, but fidelity to what is present. Even solitude no longer feels like a condition, it feels like a companion. The quiet itself is now a presence, not an absence. It holds you in the same way she once did, with a calm, unwavering attention. You are never alone here, you are attended by stillness. You write rarely now, and only in fragments, a single sentence that holds the weight of a paragraph. Stillness is a form of prayer. Some ghosts do not haunt, they wait. Everything I loved has become light. You do not seek coherence. You trust the layering of time to give each phrase its moment. Sometimes you leave a page open for days, letting dust gather along its crease. This, too, is a kind of authorship. This, too, is voice. The notebooks pile quietly, forming a landscape of intention without explanation. You flip through them and find echoes instead of memories, rhythms instead of records. Each phrase is not a message but a frequency, a way to tune the inner self to the outer hush. Your writing is no longer storytelling, it is signal, it is pulse. Your body continues its quiet transformations. The ache in the knees that once signaled aging now signals grounding. You lean into it. The heaviness of your hands reminds you how much has passed through them. You rest more often, not from fatigue, but from reverence, rest as attention, rest as offering. When you close your eyes now, it is not to escape but to deepen. You are learning the slow language of breath, of pulse, of proximity without urgency. The body is not a vessel to be carried, it is a bell. And every act of stillness is a way to let it ring. Even your heartbeat seems to speak now. In slow syllables only your chest can understand, the way you rise from the chair, the way you pause before touching a door frame. Everything is liturgy. Outside, the wind carries the memory of leaves, not their rustling, but their falling. You recognize it the way you recognize a song from a single chord. The branches are bare now, but not desolate. You see their structure more clearly without the veil of green. This is what remains. You think, not the bloom, but the scaffolding. Not the sound, but the shape left in its absence. And you are comforted, because you, too, have become structure. You, too, have shed the need to display. What remains is honest. What remains is enough. You are no longer the broadcast, you are the station, and the world, in all its layered quiet, is still tuning in. You begin to realize that remembering has softened into something else, something that no longer pulls, but simply floats. It no longer arrives in bursts of image or sound. It drifts, gentle and circular. The past is not behind you, it surrounds you. You live in it now, not as burden or wound, but as air. Even the hardest moments have shed their sharpness. They move through you like slow wind through open curtains, and as they pass, you don't flinch, you breathe. You become not a witness to memory, but the medium through which memory flows. You are porous now, permeable, and what once wounded now withers you into form. Your memory no longer works as a line, it has become a spiral, circling inward to a stillness that contains everything. The garden has gone quiet, nothing demands, nothing performs. And yet it holds its own richness, a tapestry of absence. The stems stand bare, but dignified. You kneel at the earth, no longer to tend, but to accompany. The soil is cold, your fingertips find memory in its texture. Here, once, something grew, that is enough. There is no grief in it, only gravity. You are not waiting for spring, you are sitting with winter, not as an interlude, but as a season full of its own language, its own shape, its own long exhale. There's peace in the barrenness, a hush you never knew you needed. And it teaches you something essential. Life isn't always moving toward bloom. Sometimes it pauses to rest in its own stillness. And in that pause, something sacred is held. The bareness has become a form of clarity. In the absence of foliage, you see structure, line, and shadow. And that is its own kind of beauty. The mornings begin darker now. The light arrives late and slow. Like someone hesitant to knock, you meet it without urging. The house hums its low morning tones, the groan of the floorboard, the cough of heat through the vent, the first creak of the kettle. Everything is modest, but meaningful. You move like someone not trying to wake the world too quickly. You have learned that quiet has its own clock. It ticks in gestures, a mug lifted, a curtain drawn, the hush between breath and step. Even the act of brushing your teeth becomes an act of reverence, a ritual not for appearance, but for rhythm, for belonging to the morning as it arrives, not before, not after. This slowness isn't laziness, it's presence. You are fully within the hour, not rushing through it. This is how you've chosen to honor the time you still have, by making it wide enough to hold stillness. In your notebooks, the sentences have become fewer, sometimes just one a week. But when they come, they arrive like stones dropped into still water. The rings last for days. I have mistaken urgency for importance. Not all silence is hollow. I did not come here to be known, but to know. You reread them not to remember, but to feel their slow echo. It expands within the day. The words do not explain you, they reflect you. And in their reflection, you see someone who has grown increasingly transparent to themselves. You are no longer trying to say something, you are trying to listen to what remains unsaid. The act of writing is no longer performance. It is echoing a way of reminding yourself you are here, still vibrating within the world's breath. You are not writing to be read, but to remain in rhythm with what is. The wind has taken up residence in the chimney. At night it sings low vowels that remind you of voices, not hers specifically, but the idea of voice itself. You lie awake and do not reach for distraction. You let the song continue, you let the house be your instrument. Each beam, each pane, each pipe offering a tone, and together they form something like a hymn. Not sacred in content, but in attention. It is not worship, but willingness. The willingness to be present to what most would tune out, the moan of the rafters, the sigh between gusts. Even the tapping of branches becomes music when your ears are tuned to the ordinary's depth. This house has become your organ, and the wind your choir. The world outside is not intruding. It's singing with you. You do not mark the date. You no longer note anniversaries. Instead, you mark the return of things. The crow that circles the field, the frost that edges the windows, the low sun that leans at the same angle it did once, long ago, when her voice filled your ears through static. You do not need the calendar to tell you it's been a year. The world remembers in other ways, and you remember with it, in gesture, in echo, in temperature. This is how time lives in you now, as climate, not chronology. Each return is not a reminder, but a reweaving a thread placed back into the same cloth, strengthening it by the simple act of presence. There is a ritual to this memory, a lived rhythm of return, not repetition. Each moment of déjà vu is not confusion, but confirmation. Sometimes you wonder if you have become the broadcast, not the signal, but the place it once arrived. Not the words, but the frequency that received them. Your bones have learned the language of radio. Not the content, but the waiting. Not the message, but the vibration. This is the deepest form of memory, not thought, not image, but attunement. And so you sit, hour after hour, not searching, but listening. To nothing, and everything, to what has gone, and what it left behind. You understand now that to remember her is not to recall her words, but to keep the stillness in which those words once moved. You are the quiet between broadcasts, the breath before the tone. You are the tuned receiver, humming even when no signal speaks. There are no conclusions, no grand closures, only breath, only return. You live in the looping moment now, the still signal of the world turning in its own time. And in this, you find what you did not expect, not peace, exactly, but permission. To remain, to resonate, to exist not as an answer, but as a question still humming beneath the skin. And in that hum, in that subtle music beneath all thought, you find the trace of her still present, not as presence, but as frequency, not as voice, but as listening. You do not ask what comes next, you simply remain tuned. In the hush of the day's closing, you feel it again, the gentle pulse of something greater. And you understand, you are no longer the listener, you are the listening itself. The world continues without crescendo. There is no need for it now. You move through the day not as a participant in progress, but as a witness to passage. Time no longer stands outside you, urging you forward. It breathes through you. You do not count its steps, you feel its presence in the slow migration of shadows across the floorboards, in the condensation gathering on the window pane, in the creak of wood that tells you the house is aging alongside you. You have learned not to hurry what unfolds in silence. Slowness has ceased to be lack, it has become presence. Time does not fly here, it lingers, dwells, unfurls like steam rising from a cup you hold with both hands. The air has changed again. It no longer carries the crisp certainty of frost, but the warmer confusion between seasons. You open the window a little wider than yesterday. The wind enters without resistance, a quiet companion. You let it wander through the space. Let it stir the papers on the desk, shift the edges of curtains, and graze your skin with the memory of somewhere far away. In it, you hear not weather, but a voice-shaped presence, not words, but weight. The way air changes when someone stands beside you, even if they say nothing at all. That silence, thick with implication, has become your new conversation. Even the temperature holds a kind of emotion less measurable, more remembered. You clean without schedule, dusting not to restore, but to respect. Your fingers glide over surfaces with reverence, not efficiency. Each object is a relic now, not of the past, but of endurance. The radio, the ceramic cup, the single photograph, worn and slightly curled. These are not symbols of a life once lived, they are still living. You do not arrange them to display meaning. You let them rest where they have always rested. Their stillness speaks louder than any decoration. They have nothing to prove. Like you, they have remained. Even the dust has become part of the composition, a soft veil acknowledging time rather than hiding it. Cleaning is no longer about order. It is a gentle act of recognition. Outside, the trees remain unbothered by time. Their branches stretch out like arms that have always known how to hold absence. You watch a crow land on the fence post, head turning once, twice, before lifting again. This moment means nothing to anyone else, and yet it means everything here. You feel your breath line up with its rhythm, the way it pauses, observes, and then acts. You learn again that patience is not the absence of action, but the alignment of action with presence. Nature does not hesitate, nor does it rush. It abides. In that abiding, you learn the art of waiting without longing. In the evenings, you do not reach for distraction. You sit. Sometimes by candlelight, sometimes in the hush of a fading sky. The dusk arrives like a memory retold, familiar but always new in its phrasing. You trace the glow as it slips up the wall, as it fades from the tips of the trees. No sound announces its arrival. It simply becomes. You understand now that beauty does not need introduction. It only needs a witness. And in this role, you have found your calling not to change the world, but to receive it as it is, in the quiet dignity of attention. The sky changes shades like a slow breath. Even the clouds seem to linger, drawn out across the sky like half-finished thoughts. You watch, not because something might happen, but because it already is. You are part of the unfolding, no longer a bystander to it. The journals remain open on your desk. You do not worry about finishing them. The unfinished sentence has become its own form of truth. You have stopped crossing out. You let the mess remain. Scratches, pauses, fragments, they are not failure. They are record. You read them back not as a history, but as a resonance. Not what you once thought, but how you felt the thinking arrive. Some pages are completely blank, and these, too, feel complete. They carry the weight of silence, inkless and honest. The notebook is no longer a container, it is a continuation. It doesn't end, it unfolds. Even your handwriting has changed, grown slower, more deliberate. Each letter becomes a breath on the page. At night, the world seems to hush in agreement. The ceiling sighs, the wind hums. Your breath slows without instruction. You lie still, not chasing sleep, but receiving it. You no longer dream of places you cannot return to. You dream of air, of light falling through branches, of footsteps that leave no trace, and sometimes you wake with the echo of a voice not hers, but shaped like her, sounding not in your ears, but in the hollow between ribs. It fades before you can chase it, and still, you thank it for visiting. The dreams are not destinations anymore. They are soft bridges, places to stand briefly and feel the depth of absence made gentle. Even waking becomes gentle, as if the day itself is trying not to disturb your becoming. Your life has narrowed beautifully. It contains little, but holds much. You do not seek experience anymore. You seek expression within simplicity, a hand placed on the windowsill, the smell of water heating on the stove, the flicker of dust in the light of late afternoon. These are your landscapes now, and you walk through them not as traveler or tourist, but as inhabitant. You are not watching your life, you are inside it. Finally, with no separation between yourself and the moment that contains you, each gesture is both ordinary and complete. Each movement is enough. The day doesn't need a narrative. It needs only to be lived. There is no arc to fulfill, no climax to await. Just the slow and sacred unfolding. You have become fluent in stillness. It is no longer effort, it is no longer choice, it is nature. You breathe in the space between events. You understand that not every moment must become memory. Some can simply exist, quiet, unclaimed, sacred by virtue of being left untouched. And in this untouched space, you find something you once sought everywhere else: freedom. Not escape, not liberation, but the kind that comes from belonging exactly where you are. Here, now, in the stillness that neither asks nor explains, you are whole. There is no next, only this, and that is enough. You wake before the light arrives, before the sound of morning has shaped the house into consciousness. The world, still veiled in its early hush, rests gently around you. There is no urgency, only breath. You move as though continuing a dream. The floorboards accept your step with the familiarity of ritual. You do not check the time. You do not need to. Something within you has aligned with the pulse of the hour. You stand in the kitchen, hand resting lightly on the counter, listening not for anything, but to everything. The refrigerator's hum, the wind slipping beneath the door, the silence between sounds, the echo of something unspoken and yet intimately known. You make tea without thought. Water fills the kettle like it always has, steam rising like incense in a temple with no name. The cup waits, warm in your hand. You carry it to the table where a beam of gray light begins to enter the room. Nothing in this moment distinguishes it from 1,000 others, and yet you know something is different. The difference is not in the air, or the room, or the tea, it is in you. You have grown vast in your quiet. You have become the space in which the world unfolds. Even the warmth of the ceramic against your palms feels like memory rather than sensation. You walk to the radio, not to turn it on, but to place your hand on it. The surface is cool, smooth, curved by years and memory. You don't need to hear her voice anymore to remember what it meant. It was never just the broadcast. It was the silence after it, the breath that followed, the world it left vibrating in its wake. The signal taught you how to wait, how to listen, not to respond, but to receive. And in that reception, you became something new: less a soldier, more an instrument, less a man with answers, more a question tuned to the sky. You remember the grain of her voice, its peculiar calmness, its precision that wrapped itself around you when everything else fell apart. Outside, the frost has retreated. The trees hold the stillness of decision. Not dead, not yet alive again, merely pausing in their seasonal breath. You walk to the edge of the porch and look out over the field. The mist gathers low, as it always has, draping the earth like a memory refusing to rise. The horizon is a whisper, not a line, and you no longer feel the need to draw conclusions. You have stepped out of narrative. You have left behind the desire to explain. What remains is experience, bare and sacred. The breeze is neither cold nor warm. It simply passes, like all things do. You think of the others, those who returned like you, and those who didn't. The war still echoes in your bones, but it no longer shouts. It arrives like weather passing, noticed, and let go. The names etched into monuments are not the only markers of memory. Sometimes memory lives in tea, in breath, in the stillness of an untouched room. You carry them not in grief, but in rhythm. The way your breath slows when the light fades. The way your body still turns toward the sound of a distant signal. Even though the broadcast ended long ago, their presence is not gone. It has simply entered a different register, a quieter frequency. You return to your chair and sit. No ceremony, no performance, just presence. The notebook rests nearby, open to a blank page. You do not reach for the pen. Some things do not need to be written. Some truths are too quiet for ink. Instead, you close your eyes and listen to the wind, to the creak of the house, to the echo that has lived so long inside you it has become indistinguishable from your own voice. There is nothing left to resolve. There is no resolution, only release. In the absence of striving, you have arrived, not at an ending, but at the center of something that no longer requires explanation. The day unfolds around you. Birds arrive on the branches with their small declarations. The sky brightens without spectacle. The kettle cools beside you. And in that ordinary unfolding, something profound becomes clear. This is enough. The waiting, the remembering, the listening, it was never about returning to what was. It was about allowing what is to speak through you, and it has, not in language, not in logic, but in the quiet certainty that you are still here, and that your presence is a form of peace. You were not meant to forget, you were meant to carry. Later, perhaps, you will walk to the edge of the field. You will stand where the mist begins and let it hold you. You will not try to see through it. You will let it be, like memory, like silence, like the voice that once spoke to you from across the world, reaching through static and suspicion, not to argue, but to remind you that you were still human, that you still belonged to something larger than uniform or flag, that even in conflict, there was connection. And in her voice, you found a thread, you followed it home. Even now, the air holds the echo of her final broadcast. You no longer recall the exact words, only the tone, only the stillness that followed. And now, in this moment, you realize that you have become the thread. The signal did not end, it changed form, it passed into you, into the way you live, into the way you breathe, into the way you greet the day without needing to speak. The last signal was never a goodbye, it was a passing of rhythm. From radio to breath, from voice to silence, from past to presence, you were not its audience, you were its echo. And in that echo, you endure not loudly, not even clearly, but with unwavering clarity. As steady as the hum of air before dawn, the wind presses softly against the window. A bird lands on the sill and stays a while. You do not move, you do not speak. You simply remain, listening, breathing, present. End of script. Sweet dreams.